right, so I was told I can start speaking and then it will appear, like magic. I have a little bit of a cold, so forgive me if I start coughing during the presentation. Like so. So my title is Climate Violence and the Mennonite Migration from Mexico to Colombia. So I didn't actually know how to start this presentation because every other time I've done a presentation on the Mennonites and Mennonite history, I've just spent about 5 to 10 minutes to explain how German-speaking Russian Anabaptists with Dutch last names and Canadian passports end up in northern Mexico. And since I don't really have to do that to this crowd, I can just kind of cut a good 10 minutes of my presentation out. Okay, so in 2015, a lot of Mennonites from Mexico have been migrating to the llanos, or the grasslands of Eastern Colombia. So I'm arguing that the primary reason for this new migration is due to climatic pressures rather than religious or economic reasons. So these are all pictures of the new colonies. They're growing lots of rice, is the top right corner. They have a lot of irrigation canals. They have silos. So they're a very conservative group, but they still also use tractors. And so that's a picture of in the middle of one of the new houses. So they're very well built, tidy houses, and they all have connections with electricity. So this is just the general pattern. Most of you know Russia, North America to Latin America. Okay, so I'm going to use a lot of maps in my presentation because I'm a map person. I like maps. So this is just the general area where a lot of the Mennonite colonies are in northern Chihuahua. So just pinpoint that, and then you'll see what I'm going to do in the next map. So notice the North American Drought Monitor, where the most intense parts of the drought in the Americas are. So a lot of it overlaps of northern Mexico, southwest US, northern Mexico, Sonora, Chihuahua. These are what they're even calling a mega drought that hasn't been seen in 1,200 years with the problems of rainfall and lack of rainfall. And this is a 2011 map, and it's even gotten worse. So how does climate change work? Climate change acts mostly as a catalyst. So these are regions that are obviously always going to have sort of drought, flood, back and forth patterns. But what climate change does is it makes it more, it intensifies it. So when it's a drought, it's even drier. If it does flood, it's even wetter. And this creates a circular problem in the soil composition, where the soil now, it becomes so dry that it doesn't retain water. Evaporation is accelerated. So all of the water absorption in the soil, it evaporates. So it's increased aridification in these regions. That's the main concern of climate change. So these are always going to be regions that will you have to be conscious of water usage, but climate change is making it almost irreversible. So a couple things to note. So food production across Mexico, because of this drought, has been decreasing and on the decline. The Tarahumaras are the indigenous group of northern Mexico. There was a story circulating in the news cycle in the past couple of years of a mass suicide of Tarahumaras because of food scarcity. So the state denies that it actually happened, but I haven't verified yes or no, but it did go through the news cycle. So if nothing else, this shows the desperation in people's minds of what they're thinking about the worries of the droughts. So overuse of water. So how does this fit in? So Chihuahua has lots of underground aquifers that have lots of water that have been tapped since the 1980s. 15 of them are dangerously overexploited. Tom Berry, one journalist, is saying that right now we know of northern Mexico as having lots of violence due to drug warfare and cartel violence. He's saying in the future, in 20 years, it's going to be primarily over water. And we already are starting to see this scale sliding in that direction. There has already been death due primarily to climate activists being assassinated. Mennonite control. So when I sent this to Ben, he's like, I think there's a misprint. It can't possibly be 526 million hectares. And so that's probably true. I'm just quoting, that's what it says in the source, but it's probably just a misprint of 526,000 hectares. The idea is the same, though. There's a large bit of land under Mennonite control, and they are primarily using lots of irrigation since the 1980s and using up all of the very little bit of water in the aquifers and little bit of water that's decreasing due to decrease in annual precipitation of rainfall. They're overusing it. They've extended it too far. And the Mennonites in the region are the largest consumers. Now, this has come up to lots of conflict with a group called the Los Barzanistas. So these are farmer activists who are arguing that the Mennonites are using too much of their share of the water supply for pretty much a fair argument, actually. A lot of the Mennonites have a practice of over-drilling, and they're getting too many permits for it. So in the Mennonites' defense, the governments are giving them permits. The Barzanistas are saying, well, that's because you're paying the government official to give you a permit because the system's corrupt. You just give them some money under the table. And that's probably also true, but that's also probably just true because that's the system that, unfortunately, that's how it works there. So this is lots of conflict between the Barzanistas, the communal farmers in the region, and the Mennonite farmers who have these large-scale private property farms. So the Mennonites have used up 80% of the total water reserves. So this is where violence. So Alberto Fernandez, he was a retired politician. He was protesting a lot of the illegal wells. So in 1 year, I think in 2015, in fact, over 500 illegal well permits were given. So he was protesting that, and he was shot dead in 2015, the same year that the Mennonites ended up leaving northern Chihuahua. And he's not the only one. There's quite a list of every couple of years these activists being assassinated. So this also follows a trajectory of Mennonites, like we've been talking about, coming and going out of Canada, out of Mexico. Mennonites going to Belize because of disagreements with the government, going to Paraguay, going to Bolivia, going to Campeche. But this is a different migration, at least that's what I'm arguing. The migration to Colombia is primarily, or a large factor in it, is due to water scarcity because of climate change. So how did they hear about Colombia? Apparently it was just providential. This has also just been a rumor I've heard in a couple different sources. One Mennonite was going across the border in Texas to buy some agricultural machinery. He met a Colombian petroleum engineer somehow who suggested, hey, you have a lot of problems in Mexico. You should come to Colombia where we have lots of farmland and there's plenty of water. So 2014, Mennonites send a delegation to Colombia. They find it very satisfactory. 2015 is when they actually make the move. So this is just a little map of Colombia. Meta is, culturally, it's very similar to Texas, Chihuahua. It's like cowboy culture. Most of the land has been ranches historically rather than large agricultural farmlands. And so this is just the state they're in. So Meta, you notice, it's kind of almost in the exact middle of the country. And they're in kind of on the far side of it. So geographically, Bogota is the capital. That's in the little mountain range. So that's kind of bisects the country in the middle. And then all of Eastern Colombia are these low flatlands. All of Colombia gets a fair amount of rain. And then you see the new Mennonite colony right there on that river, the Meta River that flows from the Andes into into the plains. So it's Puerto Gaitan is the port on the river, and then about an hour outside of Puerto Gaitan is the new colonies. And so it's only about a 4-hour drive from the capital. So they are still very close to the market. They're not exactly looking for isolation in this instance. Okay, so 2015, they bought 3 large haciendas, Livni, Australia, and La Florida, approximately 90 kilometers outside the city of Puerto Gaitan. So it's obviously much more rural, but again, it's not very isolated. There are roads that come all the way to the village that they're outside of. These are the basic sectors of the new colonies. So the original 3 were 2015. Since then, they've established 3 more colonies. So as of 2022, there are 6 colonies total. And they're all they're not necessarily side by side, but they're all kind of grouped together in close proximity. And they're still looking for new land to buy within that same region. One of the big reasons that they apparently have decided with Colombia to choose for Colombia, besides just the rainfall, is they can buy large tracts of land. So they're buying these old ranches that used to just have lots of cows that these old large-scale landowners, the elite of Colombia, are owning and selling to the Mennonites because they can buy this large ranch and then break it up into smaller farms for all the families. So in the news, when they are describing the main reason for their migration, Raymond Dyke, one of the leaders of the Livni colony, I believe, he says, "Acá hay agua." So here there's water. So the emphasis on finding some place where there's water that they can still grow and still be farmers is throughout this timeline. So it's also been very beneficial on the Colombian side. They've had a lot of support from the Congress and from the governor of Meta and the mayor of Puerto Gaitan. They've imported lots of machinery, $2.5 million worth of machinery and equipment. In fact, still in the colonies, at least when I visited them in 2020, you would just find empty shipping containers, just like in the corner, just left there. So they really just came and started working. And then they've also established 3 separate agro-businesses. So Florida Farming, which actually has a YouTube channel. If you would like to check it out, he shows all his little farming and irrigation, what he's growing. He's kind of using that as a promotional tool, I think, to try and get more people from Mexico to come to Colombia. And he does also emphasize that there's rain and there's water in several videos. Agroindustrial Llanos, La Esperanza. Llanos is just the name for the plains, so cowboy, like llanero just means cowboy in that region. And Agricola ends. So they're primarily growing, right now they're growing corn as far as I know. They tried rice, they tried soy, but corn is the one that has been given the best returns. They've also had some experimentation with cotton. So they're really bringing a lot of the agricultural knowledge that they've already gained in Mexico to the region. Crops. So one problem, even though there is water, is the soil is not necessarily the same type of soil that they're used to in Mexico. So they've had to reconfigure the composition of the soil by adding calcium in order to really get a successful crop. But all of this has led to problems of its own. So several Colombian environmental groups, including Mangabe, which is a regional environmental group, is complaining about the Mennonite activities. So the soil calcification, it makes it more difficult for the crops and plants that are indigenous to that region to now grow because it changes the soil composition. They're clearing a lot of ancient forests. The irrigation that they've set in and the pesticides and the chemicals they're using, fertilizers they're using, is now getting into the water supply. And downstream, there's a lot of indigenous communities that are now no longer able to fish from that water supply because a lot of the fish are dying out because of all of the pollutants. So the Sikuna, one of their big complaints, pretty much what I just described, we live from hunting and fishing. The Mennonites are very close to the canals. The water is contaminated and the fish don't return. We have to take water from these streams that are dying up. It's also important to note that Colombia is, I think, the first or the second country in the world with the highest amount of assassinations of climate activists and environmental activists. People like this are, they call them in Colombia líderes sociales, social leaders, but it's all these type of activist groups that are constantly in danger of being assassinated, not necessarily from the government, but from a lot of paramilitary groups that are still active in the area. So Meta is relatively safe, but there's still just the legacy of Colombia with lots of violence of the FARC. Like, I'm sure many of you have read the news of Colombia's long history with FARC and lots of the drug problems, but also a lot of paramilitary groups in the area that are somewhat allowed by the government, even though they're technically illegal. They kill a lot of social activists. So there's a lot of problems in the area, even if it is not technically a red zone. So this is the development of it. If you can look at the map, it's a little hard from this angle, but this is one of the colonies. That's very impressive, but in a way it's also very indicative of the amount of water you can actually see that they're going to be using if it's all this new farmland. So, conclusions. I think this case study kind of shows the nuance of this idea of climate refugee. So are they actually refugees or are they migrants? How do we conceptualize this? I think that maybe the refugees are the ones who can't afford, they don't have the capital to make these types of moves. But I think this complicates the conversation. And then just the interconnectedness of environmental issues. There's no escaping environmental problems. You're gonna have problems in Mexico, in Canada, in the US, and then if you go somewhere else, it's gonna happen again. So migration may not be the way out, rather than dealing with it in the place you're at. So these aren't necessarily nice conclusions, but I think these are things that we need to start thinking about. So, thank you.
My name is Peter Rempel. Maybe as a preface to my question, I would say I've worked for Mennonite church agencies all my life, and I've been wondering about the role of the church leaders in all of these movements. I'm thinking about this in terms of the birth rates that Bruce talked about, and about the Han and Tridge, where Mennonite church leaders were maybe complicit in sending people to a place that was not suitable, and then were they then the resistors to the return, or the welcomers? Did they just tag along? And I'm thinking here, were they part of a diplomacy relationships with Mexico? Are they part of this perpetual motion or permanence? And are they part of the move to Colombia? Are they leaders in that, or are they just tagging along? Where are the church leaders in all of these movements?
And so
how have they changed?
I think this question can be for everyone, so I'll translate it. Pues, ¿cuál es el papel de los líderes de la iglesia en todo eso? Eso era, según él, como en todos los acontecimientos, tanto en la llegada a México, que pueden contestar ustedes, como a Colombia y como los movimientos que mencionó Ben. Entonces, todos ustedes pueden contestar. ¿Cómo gustan?
I can start. So as far as I know, they're in the movement, but they're not leading it. It's primarily led by people thinking more about in terms of the farming aspect of it. So they actually did, I didn't mention this in my talk, but they did get the privileges like they normally do. But importantly, they did not even ask for control over their religious education, and they did not ask for a refutation of the swearing of oaths. The primary request was that they are they don't have to take part in the draft for the military. But besides that, the normal litany of privileges that have to do with the religious aspect of it, they were not concerned with. It was mostly to do with the taxes, exemption of import taxes, things like that. So I would say another reason why I would say that this migration is primarily due to climate pressure rather than religious motivation.
Hola, buenas tardes. Patricia Islas de la Universidad Autónoma de Ciudad Juárez en Chihuahua, México. Quisiera preguntarle al último ponente si sabe en su investigación si algunas de las familias que migraron de Cuauhtémoc a Colombia se han tenido que regresar debido a la violencia generada por las FARC en Colombia.
And so this is a question for Sam about the people who went from Cuauhtémoc to Colombia, if any of them have had to return to Mexico because of violence in Mexico. And this is Patricia Islas from the Autonomous University of Ciudad Juárez in Chihuahua. Yeah, so leaving violence in Colombia and returning to Mexico for safety.
Yes, yes.
So not to my knowledge, most of the trouble they've had has been more legal issues with the indigenous groups and with environmental groups. There have been some, I actually interviewed someone in Almer who was getting help from the MCC who had actually tried, he had gone to Colombia, but then his farm had failed. And so then he was in Canada working for the summer to build up capital to then go back to Colombia to try again. So most of, I think, the returnees have been primarily due to farm failures and then going back to Mexico or Canada to rebuild capital to then return to do another colonization effort. But a lot of the fighting has been primarily for legal issues. I haven't read anything in terms of the violence of FARC. That region is not really, so they also kind of went in at an interesting time in Colombian history where the government was working towards a peace deal in 2016. And then the peace deal fell through, and then they did a reiterated version of it. But that was primarily with FARC. There's several other violent groups, but as of right now, the zone that they're in is a relatively safe zone. There are regions in Colombia that are considered red zones that they say don't go into because that's controlled by paramilitary or FARC or drug-related groups. But Meta has trouble, but it's not because of that. It's not just legal issues in terms of environmental issues. It's also due to the history of the violence of the country. Claim to titles to land, it's very difficult to determine who actually originally owned the land. So there's some issue that maybe some of the land that they've purchased didn't actually belong to the person who sold it to them. The person just paid an official to make a document that looks official and then sold it to some Mennonites. There's some talk about that, but I haven't actually read anything about any issues that have actually happened in court with that yet.
Para resumir súper brevemente, los problemas han sido legales por quién es dueño de la tierra. Hay gente que fabrica o que manufactura el papeleo para decir que tienen permiso para vender la tierra. Y esa zona de Colombia no es una zona súper problemático con relación a la violencia de la FARC, pero hay otras áreas súper violentas y también llegaron en el momento de como un proceso de paz en Colombia. Y sí tenemos una pregunta más. So we have one more final question, and then it's coffee time.
Tracy Huruska, and Sam, this is actually a follow-up, a nice segue from that. I interviewed a couple of people in very northern Chihuahua who owned land in Colombia, but who hadn't moved yet. And they mentioned that there was a rumor that part of the reason that land had been sold to the Mennonites was part of a government strategy to shift the balance of power between insurgent groups. And I was wondering if you had heard anything about that, and this relates to an earlier question about the kind of role of Mennonites in imperial ambitions and negotiations with local powers.
So I haven't actually heard anything in the Colombian news about that necessarily. There might be some problems with, because there has been claimed from the indigenous groups that some of the land, like some of the forests they've burned down, has been land that was supposed to be slotted for indigenous groups. But that's also, there's legal lawsuits that the indigenous groups are working against the Mennonites. But the Mennonites have a lot of support from the local government, Puerto Gaitan. And so from what I've read, most of it has been, the government and Mennonites have kind of made deals, and it's been kind of smoothed out that way.
Well, thank you all so much for all of your excellent questions, and I hope we can continue this conversation over our coffee break before the next panel. Un aplauso.